Taxes feel modern. They are not. Pharaohs used them to build power. Rome used them to control provinces. Kings used them to shape entire societies. Some taxes fed empires. Some were absurd. Some changed history. This is how taxes began.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that is foundational to every organized society. It's responsible for building everything from the Great Pyramids to, your local highway, and yet it remains perpetually unpopular. We're talking about taxes.
And it's funny you say that because if you look at the etymology, the whole concept of tax is actually rooted in the idea of support.
Support.
Exactly. Every advanced society needs support, for defense, monuments, basic public services. The real challenge, and this has spanned millennia, is how do you get that support without provoking total civil unrest?
That's the tension we're diving into today. Our mission is to trace this evolution of funding. We're going from mandatory labor and these just bizarre behavioral taxes like taxing beards.
The beard tax is a classic.
All the way to the complex progressive systems we use today. We really need to figure out what fundamental lessons rulers learned about, human nature when it comes to paying up.
Right, and how we got to this modern idea of tax fairness.
Yeah, what does that even mean?
Well, what we're tracking here is a constant political calculation. It's always how much revenue can we generate for the state without tipping people into widespread evasion or, open rebellion. The methods changed over time, but that pressure point is eternal.
Okay, let's unpack this. We should start where large-scale civilization really began its financial calculations. So the ancient world, let's start in the 3rd century BC with the Egyptian pharaohs.
Yeah, the pharaohs needed immense resources. I mean, we're talking about funding these expensive symbolic monuments of power.
The pyramids.
The pyramids,
Yeah.
exactly. And, of course, just the day-to-day maintenance of the royal court, bureaucracy. Their primary methods were, they were direct and pretty heavy-handed.
Okay.
So you had mandatory labor services where people were just compelled to work on state projects. Then harvest duties, customs duties, basically tolls on goods moving through the land.
So the average Egyptian wasn't necessarily paying in coin. They were paying in, grain? Or just sweat equity?
Exactly. But, it wasn't purely self-serving on the pharaoh's part. Those taxes and that forced labor also funded public goods. Things like maintaining irrigation systems, building roads, establishing bridges.
Not actual infrastructure.
Crucial infrastructure for the general welfare. So they were providing a public service in exchange for that revenue, even if the methods were autocratic.
Okay, so if the pharaohs were all about centralized control and forced labor, the Romans, who came later, developed what seemed like a much smarter loophole for their own citizens.
They did, at least initially. The genius of early Roman finance was relying primarily on tributes, basically money extracted from conquered provinces.
Right.
So if you were a Roman citizen living in Rome, this huge influx of wealth from conquest meant you were generally exempt from domestic taxes.
That sounds like a dream, but it also suggests a really precarious economy. I mean, if Rome's war machine stopped, the treasury would just hit a wall, wouldn't it?
Precisely. The system only worked as long as conquest continued. Roman citizens only had to pay taxes in special high-pressure situations like when the military war fund was completely empty.
And for everything else.
Otherwise, the state financed itself through customs duties, road fees, and various user fees.
But that has to lead to the classic problem, right? Widespread cheating and evasion, people lying about their assets, fudging customs declarations. The state didn't have a reliable tax base.
And that systemic leakiness is exactly what drove Kaiser Augustus, around 31 BC, to completely overhaul the system. He recognized that to stabilize the empire, the government needed a reliable, direct, and mandatory tax system. This was revolutionary.
Why revolutionary?
Because it just fundamentally changed the state's relationship with its citizens.
Okay, so he introduced 3 key taxes that really define the future of taxation. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. First, you brought in the head tax. It was a flat rate, so everyone paid the same lump sum, regardless of income.
To ensure universal participation.
You got it. Second, the land tax, which targeted wealth tied up in assets and property. That made sure the rich paid more than the average laborer. These 2 direct taxes, applied together, created a broad, mandatory financial baseline.
And the third tax was also pretty forward-thinking, wasn't it?
Yes, the inheritance transfer tax. It was levied on the transfer of property after death. And this particular levy later evolved into what we'd recognize today as the Roman sales tax, a tax on economic transactions.
So Augustus's reforms were all about establishing legitimacy and reliability.
Right, by forcing direct participation from everyone.
Speaking of reliability, we have to mention a later attempt at financial ingenuity that really demonstrated the limits of state power. Kaiser Vespasian's famous attempt to tax public toilets.
It's maybe the most famous anecdote in tax history. Vespasian was deeply in debt, and he was looking for a major financial coup. So he taxed the collection of urine from public facilities, which was used in industrial processes, like tanning.
Right. And when his son complained, he gave us that immortal line.
He did. His son Titus complained the tax was vile, and Vespasian reportedly said, "Pecunia non olet, money doesn't stink."
A great line, but the market fought back, didn't it?
It did. The people of Rome quickly showed that if a service is necessary but the tax is clumsy or seen as unfair, they will simply use alternatives.
They found other quiet places.
They found other quiet places. The tax was a major failure. It just proved that even taxes on necessary services can be avoided if the structure is poor.
That failure perfectly illustrates why the medieval world largely transitioned away from trying to find every little source of wealth and instead focused on easier points of collection.
Absolutely. As power shifted, the financial focus shifted too. You see the rise of the church, which gained enormous societal influence and mandated the biblical tithe, the biblical tenth. This was mandatory. Believers had to pay 1/10 of their produce or income.
So the basis of the payment moved from funding physical things like roads to funding spiritual salvation.
Precisely. Yeah. And at the same time, as cities gained autonomy and needed their own local funding, they started favoring indirect taxes on consumption. These were known as excises.
Why were these consumption taxes preferred over, say, trying to implement an income tax?
Oh, they were just administratively much simpler. It's far easier to collect a tax on a keg of beer, a barrel of wine, or a bag of salt at the city gate than it is to, calculate the varying and often hidden income of every craftsman and merchant.
So it is just practical.
Very practical. These taxes on necessities and minor luxuries like lotteries were stable revenue streams, and they were less likely to provoke a direct confrontation than a direct tax on personal wealth.
There's one particularly interesting example from medieval England that shows taxes could be used to buy freedom, not just fund the king's treasury. Tell us about the Schildgeld, or shield money.
This was a genuine innovation. Compulsory military service was the norm, right? But the shield money, introduced by Heinrich I, allowed citizens to purchase an exemption from that military duty.
So you could pay your way out of going to war?
You could. And if you paid the tax, the king could then use that money to hire a professional soldier, often a mercenary. It was a monetization of military manpower. It professionalized the armed forces while offering citizens a choice.
A payment for choice. That transition takes us into one of the most colorful periods of tax history, using taxes specifically as a tool for social engineering.
This is where rulers started to see the tax code as more than just a ledger sheet. They were actively trying to direct the habits and cultural preferences of their people through financial penalties.
The ultimate example here is Tsar Peter the Great in Russia. He wasn't subtle about his goal at all. He wanted to force Russia to adopt Western European standards, and that meant getting rid of traditional long boots.
So he taxed them. If a man insisted on keeping his voluminous traditional beard, he had to pay a substantial annual fee up to 100 rubles.
Wow.
It was a direct financial deterrent aimed at forcing cultural conformity. You literally paid for your right to be unmodern.
That's just a powerful illustration of the state dictating style choices. It shows the tax was secondary to the cultural goal. And this kind of arbitrary status-based taxation persisted even after major upheavals like the French Revolution.
Absolutely. The bureaucracy still loved taxing visible markers of status. Consider 18th century Prussia. They implemented the maiden tax, which was levied on unmarried women between 20 and 40.
The existence of a tax specifically targeting single women in that age bracket is just astounding. Was the motivation purely revenue, or was it also a subtle push toward family formation?
It was likely a blend. Revenue was the stated goal, of course, but any tax that targets a specific demographic carries a social implication. Similarly, in England, they had the hat tax and excise on every hat set.
Hat tax.
Hat tax. And back in Prussia, wig wearers were subject to a luxury possession tax. If you wore a wig, the state saw it as a financial opportunity. It shows how persistent the habit of taxing status symbols really was.
So we've covered forced labor, salvation fees, taxes for military freedom, and now taxes on whiskers and hats. But the system we live under today, the one that uses tax brackets, only emerged relatively recently. When did that foundational shift happen?
The truly revolutionary reform occurred during the Wilhelmine era in Germany. It was largely driven by the Prussian finance minister, a man named Johannes von Miquel. This moment, at the turn of the 20th century, is when the progressive income tax, as we know it, was really born.
And this wasn't just another tax. This was a comprehensive philosophical shift, right? What was Miquel's central contribution?
He established a fully integrated and mandatory system of direct taxation. He introduced a uniform income tax, a wealth tax targeting overall assets, and a business tax. These three parts ensured the state captured revenue from labor, from capital, and from commercial activity.
But the real intellectual leap, the concept that redefined the social contract, was the creation of Steuer progression, tax progression.
Precisely. This established the principle that has defined modern finance. Who earns more, pays more. This was a critical departure from the flathead taxes of Augustus's Rome. Progression legitimized taxation by linking the tax burden directly to the ability to pay. It framed it as a matter of social fairness, not just arbitrary collection.
That structural framework is what made the system defensible. But Miquel still had to solve that old Roman problem of evasion. How did he enforce this new complex structure?
By establishing mandatory declaration. Miquel made filing a tax declaration a compulsory legal duty. Before this, compliance was sporadic, maybe optional. By making self-reporting mandatory and standardizing the legal framework, he created the enforcement mechanism necessary for a progressive system to actually function.
This German reform fundamentally changed how the world operates. It moved the financial focus from arbitrary status symbols toward measurable individual economic strength, and it proved to be an incredibly effective revenue engine.
Its effectiveness is undeniable. I mean, even today, taxes are Germany's single largest source of income. Our sources highlight that back in 2015, the tax yield was 620 billion euros, and that number has only grown.
That scale is just necessary to finance the modern state.
The welfare state, defense, infrastructure, all of it.
And yet today, while Miquel's progressive model is dominant, the implementation varies wildly. It creates this intense global competition for capital. Let's look at the extremes, starting with the tax havens. Which regions completely opt out of this model?
A number of countries don't levy income taxes on individuals at all. We're talking about places like Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. They tend to rely on massive centralized revenue streams, usually oil or gas exports.
So they can compete for global talent by removing that progressive burden entirely.
Exactly. And Panama is also highlighted in our sources as a historical good loophole used for offshore financial structuring.
And contrasting that, which countries today commit most strongly to the progressive principle with the highest top tax rates for high earners?
For that, you look to the Nordic countries. Denmark and Sweden lead the world, with top tax rates sitting between 55% and 57%. Those rates support their extremely robust universal social safety nets.
And where does Germany, the originator of progression, sit on that global scale?
Germany is firmly in the upper middle field in Europe, with a top rate around 45%. It shows a persistent commitment to Miquel's principles, but at a rate that's mindful of the global competition from those low-tax alternatives.
It's a delicate balance, and it brings us full circle to that original definition. Tax is derived from support. We've seen that support extracted via forced labor, tithes for salvation, fees to buy military exemption, and finally, a structure based on income fairness.
The function remains the same. But what's most fascinating to me is how often taxes were historically used not just to collect money, but to subtly or very overtly change public behavior. The beard tax is the perfect example of using finance as a tool of social steering.
So if we take that historical context, the sheer power of the tax code to guide action, and connect it to Miquel's system, which was designed for fairness, this raises an important question for the future.
It does. Given that taxes have historically been used to achieve specific societal outcomes, what modern pressing societal or environmental behaviors, maybe related to climate change or resource scarcity, might future governments try to steer using a curious new tax? It makes you wonder if we'll see a resurgence of behavioral taxes, but this time aimed at achieving global goals, something for you to consider the next time you look at a receipt or a tax form.